Hello everybody, I'm the Academic Leftist. Welcome to my third video. Just a reminder, if you find these videos useful, please remember to like, subscribe, and comment below. So in this video, I'm going to be discussing racial inequality and mass incarceration in the United States. Specifically, I'll be addressing the question, is racial animus or racial inequality responsible for the massive increase in incarceration of African Americans in the United States since the 1980s? This is obviously an important and reasonable question, since the United States currently incarcerates more African Americans or blacks in the United States per capita than South Africa did at the height of apartheid. So something is clearly responsible for this massive disparity in outcome in the United States. Now, to address this question, I'm going to use Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, as a peg to explore these issues. And I'm going to use this book specifically because it was a national bestseller and because it's been highly influential within the academic community and among the general population. It's been cited thousands of times, and it's usually the go-to resource that individuals use when they want to actually make the argument that racial animus was responsible for this massive increase in incarceration of the African American population. So, in a nutshell, Michelle Alexander's thesis is the following. She argues that in the aftermath of the civil rights movement and desegregation, white Americans, or at least some segment of the white American population, and Republican and Democratic elites were looking for a way to contain the aspirations and this new movement that had sprung up in the midst of the protests against segregation, and they wanted to find a new way to contain potential working class aspirations, and they were looking for a way to essentially contain this aspirant movement and prevent this threat to the capitalist class order, which was peculiar in the United States because capitalism had always been infused with institutional racism.
We as a society ended the war on poverty and declared the war on drugs. Black men found themselves suddenly disposable, no longer necessary to the functioning of the US economy, precisely at the same moment that a backlash was brewing against the civil rights movement, a backlash that made it convenient for politicians to demonize Black men as criminals, as shiftless, as unwilling to work. And so this war on drugs was declared, and Black men found that they were no longer needed to work in the fields, no longer needed to labor in factories, and they found themselves scapegoats, pawns in political games, the enemy in a new war, and were rounded up by the millions.
Now, the argument that Alexander offers is very similar to the argument put forward by a sociologist at the University of Berkeley named Lois Wacant, who argued in this seminal paper published in New Left Review that American capitalism had always been shaped by four peculiar institutions. Number one, plantation slavery. Two, Jim Crow. 3, the ghetto, and 4, mass incarceration. Wacant argued that Jim Crow came to shape capitalism in the South with the sharecropping system as a way of essentially extracting surplus from landless black laborers who had been denied a redistribution of land, contrary to promises made in the aftermath of the Civil War. With the termination of Jim Crow, according to Wacant, the ghetto came to replace the institution of segregation. And then in the aftermath of the ghetto riots, you also had the emergence of mass incarceration of a way of containing the black struggle. And then according to Wacant and also Alexander, mass incarceration had this symbiotic relationship with the ghetto, or it came to have this type of symbiotic relationship beginning in the 1980s, where Black Americans were recycled out from the prison and went back to the ghetto, and then went from the ghetto back into the prison, and you had this revolving door, which was a way of ensuring that there was a compliant labor force that was available for the new low-wage service sector. It was really a way to extract surplus value from a low-wage black underclass in the aftermath of the civil rights movement. Now, according to Alexander, with the onset of the Southern strategy, the Republicans moved to tap into a new racist white voter bloc in the Southern states and replace the Democratic Party. And they used new terms such as law and order and property as a way of tapping into this electoral base without overtly referencing racist beliefs. Now, according to Alexander, the drug war was used as a pretext to begin incarcerating African Americans, especially low-wage or impoverished African Americans in the aftermath of the civil rights movement, in order to prevent those protests from ever erupting into something far more radical. So once official segregation was over, the war on drugs was employed by the Reagan administration to begin rounding up and arresting Black Americans in massive numbers and then convicting and incarcerating them or moving them through the prison system. Now, Alexander points out that contrary to popular opinion, the war on drugs was actually declared by the Reagan administration in the early 1980s, well before the crack cocaine epidemic. So it can't really be explained by a spike in drug use among Americans. And so she uses this fact to then build her argument that the war on drugs was in fact not about drug use or possession or about any type of an epidemic, but rather it was about trying to contain the African American population and incarcerating them in mass numbers, as I previously mentioned. Now, the question we have to ask is whether this account put forward by Alexander and Wacant is sufficient to explain the massive increase in incarcerated Black Americans beginning in the 1980s. Well, there are a couple problems with this argument. The first one, which Alexander acknowledges, is that the vast majority of individuals who are convicts in the United States or who are behind bars are not in there for drug offenses. Rather, they're in there for violent crime. So the data shows that at the federal level, a little over 40% of convicts are behind bars for drug offenses, while at the state level, it's less than 15%. Rather, as I mentioned, the vast majority of Americans who are behind bars are there for violent crimes or homicide. Now, Alexander is aware of this statistic, and she has responded to critics by essentially arguing that for her, the incarceration system or the prison system isn't just about who's actually behind bars, but it's about everybody who's also on parole, who has a record, who has been arrested and pled down. And when you look at those numbers, a large number of African Americans are in fact arrested for drug offenses, and they're essentially put on parole or they're pled down to a lesser offense. Now, while this is true, it still doesn't answer the question as to why you had this huge spike in incarceration among African Americans beginning in the 1980s or, in the 1970s by some accounts. And to answer this question, we really can't look at the war on drugs or drug offenses. So, what is responsible for this spike? Well, here we can look at another article that I referenced in a previous video, the piece by two sociologists, one from the University of Chicago and one from Harvard University, Clegg and Udmani. Now, Udmani and Clegg argue, as I mentioned before, that the main driver of incarceration and violent crime in the United States was concentrated poverty beginning in the 1960s as a result of a great migration of African Americans from in the 1920s and 1930s, African Americans who were fleeing white terrorism and lynchings, and who also came to the north as a result of the mechanization of agriculture in the U.S. South. Now, as they began settling in the urban areas, this led to a huge increase in concentrated poverty in very dense population centers. And as a result of this, you began to see this increase in violent crime beginning in the 1960s, as was pointed out in a previous video, and it can be again seen in this graph of homicide and violent crime. Now, given that African Americans were the hardest hit when it came to concentrated poverty, it's not surprising that African Americans were also the primary victims and perpetrators of violent crime. Now, as we can see from this graph, concentrated poverty doesn't discriminate when it comes to violent crime. Clegg and Udmani point out, using this data, that a white high school dropout had a much higher rate of committing a violent crime and therefore being incarcerated than a Black college graduate in the United States in the 1960s and the 1970s. So again, the real culprit here is concentrated poverty, not necessarily institutional racism. Now, it should be pointed out that both these sociologists also note that institutional racism and the biases of judges and racial discrimination and bias within the judicial system and the criminal justice system is responsible for some fraction of the disparate outcome in incarceration among Black Americans and white Americans. But it cannot simply explain the huge increase, the massive influx of violent crime that took place, nor can it explain the massive increase in incarceration in the United States beginning in the 1980s of the African American population. This had to do with the fact that they were the hardest hit by concentrated poverty. Now, it's also important to note that the American political elites, when faced with violent crime, did have a choice to make. They could either engage in massive redistribution of income, which would have required taxation of the elite, or they could turn to the construction of new prisons and the increase in police and security within areas hit by concentrated poverty. Now, as is pointed out in that article, clearly they chose the latter route simply because it was less threatening to economic elite, and because the construction of prisons and a huge influx in police and prosecutors and get tough legislation was far easier to sell to the general American population. Now, it should also be mentioned that the American judicial system is susceptible to voter opinion in a way that other judicial systems are not susceptible to. And this is also pointed out by Clegg and Udmani. So in the United States, because of federalism, policies pertaining to incarceration and security and crime take place at the local, state, and federal level. And when you had this huge increase in violent crime, the population was demanding change. And what's interesting here is that it was not just the white American population that took this punitive term in terms of their attitudes. As Udmani and Clegg also point out, the black American population was also demanding some type of change or some type of a response from politicians in response to this huge increase in violent crime, which afflicted black neighborhoods more than other neighborhoods in the United States. So faced with redistribution or faced with get tough on crime policies, politicians chose the latter. And this is actually what's responsible, or what drove largely the massive increase in arrests and convictions and incarceration in the United States. Now, it should also be pointed out that when the Reagan administration declared war on drugs in the early 1980s, this doesn't necessarily mean it was done as a racist pretext to begin arresting African Americans for drug possession. There were a number of other reasons that went into the calculation of Reagan administration officials. One of them, and this has been pointed out by Noam Chomsky in certain articles and lectures, was that the war on drugs came to be used as a pretext to essentially meddle in the affairs of Central and Latin American countries as a way of crushing leftist movements and revolutionary uprisings and, guerrilla actions, places like Nicaragua and El Salvador. So there was a foreign policy dimension behind Reagan's declaration of the war on drugs during this period. Some of it did probably have to do with placating his electoral base, or one segment of the Republican electoral base. But it's highly unlikely that the declaration of the war on drugs was solely driven by any type of racist motivation by Reagan administration officials, because again, it was political elites at every level of government, Democrats and Republicans, who had to respond to the public anxiety that was gripping the United States with this massive increase in violent crime. Now, the point here is not that racism isn't partially responsible for the increase in the imprisonment of African American men, and it's not that racism doesn't have some role to play in the war on drugs. But the point here is that you need a political economy analysis to understand, number one, the influx in violent crime, and number two, to understand the response by political and economic elites to this crisis. Now, I should finally say one thing. Some commentators and analysts have pointed out that get tough legislation or tough on crime legislation was implemented at times and in certain states such as California when the violent crime rate was decreasing. But what they failed to note, and what's also mentioned in the article by Clegg and Udmani, is that these decreases in violent crime were, sporadic. Violent crime would decrease for one or two years, but the trend in the 10 years prior to these decreases was upward. And so really that interruption in this increase in violent crime was not sufficient to have politicians abandon the issue of crime and violence and the response to this violence. And given the structure of the US federal system, and given the structure of the US financial system, and given the nature of US capitalism and the regressive nature of the tax system, it really was unlikely that the United States would respond to this influx of violent crime with anything other than incarceration. In order for them to have responded with a redistribution of income, you would have had to have a much stronger labor movement, which for a number of reasons did not materialize. And so politicians essentially just resorted again to the police system and incarceration. Now, I should mention here that this did work to a certain extent. Incarceration and police presence and investing in the police does, contrary to the position that certain left-wing analysts take, it does have an impact on crime, and it does make a dent on crime rates and on homicide rates especially, but it's really an inefficient system. It's based on the ability of the police to navigate certain communities, and it requires a certain level of cooperation between the communities most afflicted by crime and concentrated poverty, and it requires a certain degree of cooperation between communities that are most afflicted by concentrated poverty and violent crime and the police forces. And when you have things like police brutality, and you have things like police killings, and you have allegations of racism, and when that trust breaks down, then the police withdraw, and it's no longer possible to actually contain crime in that fashion. And so really the point here is that redistribution of income or some change in the property structure in the United States would be the most efficient way to do away with violent crime and to begin to make a dent in incarceration. So anyways, I hope that this video has been useful and that it's been informative. Again, if you enjoyed it, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you in a fourth video next week. Thank you.